Welcome to the 47-minute webinar. We are excited for everyone to be here. Today, we're talking about integrity, and I'm going to give a little overview here. Everybody's watching, staff and volunteer care, decision factors, and we'll do a little Q&R, which is question and response, a little different than question and answer because we might not have the answers, but we can have a response or we can find the answers later. So I can't guarantee an answer, but can definitely guarantee a response. But we're talking about leading with integrity. And so I want to start off just with some interaction in the chat box. So feel free to pull up the chat box. And what's your definition of integrity? How do you define this word integrity? I'm going to be talking about it from a couple different angles today, but go ahead and go to the chat box and real quick type out how you would define integrity. And let's see, doing the right thing when no one is watching. I like that.
Ditto, Jeremy.
Does that mean you can do the wrong thing when people are watching? No, just kidding. Okay. Carrie said, keeping your word. Jeremy's laughing. He must be on mute. He's laughing out loud at my dad jokes. Keeping your word. Let's see if any others come in here. How do you define integrity? Being honest. Love it. Trustworthy.
Good stuff.
And there may be a few more that come in. I want to jump to our next screen. The good old, does anyone go to the dictionary anymore?
Is there a dictionary?
There's a dictionary, but here's like the online dictionary version of this. Integrity, the quality of being honest. So someone mentioned honest earlier, and having strong moral principles, moral uprightness. And so I kind of like the definition that Jeremy gave. Doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. Of course, that, it's doing the right thing when people are watching. But man, sometimes we think no one's watching, we can get away with it. So that's a really common definition of integrity. But if we go down to this third bullet point, kind of under number 2, the condition of being unified, unimpaired, or sound in construction. We're going to be talking about that as well here in a little bit. But let's go to the next slide. First of all, everybody's watching. And so this is playing into a little bit of the definition that Jeremy threw out, doing the right thing, even when nobody is watching. But the reality is everybody's watching. So I want to speak to this, and I call this a personal integrity. So I'm going to be talking about in kind of 3 different types of integrity. This first one's personal integrity. And when we're leading with integrity, the idea is always doing the right thing when everybody is watching, even when nobody's watching. But when we behave or act as if everybody is watching, it might change our behaviors. And if it does, then we want to live up to that higher standard and go ahead and behave, act, make decisions, speak as if everybody's watching, everybody's listening. And the fact is, whether nobody is watching in the moment or not, eventually everyone's going to find out. This is a lesson I'm trying to teach my kids. You may think you're getting away with something because nobody's around, nobody's watching, but the reality is it's going to come to the surface eventually. Little jokes that they say at school that ends up becoming a problem. They get in trouble. I get a phone call from the principal. How did you find out? It's like, man, I used to think it was a parental superpower. Mom and Dad, how'd you find out? But the reality is it's always found out. That's just the reality of life. Eventually it's going to be found out. So we need to live our lives with this personal integrity, always doing the right thing. And I think integrity is lacking in the workplace today. There's a wonderful, wonderful podcast I love to listen to. And unfortunately, it revolves and it's kind of birthed out of a lack of integrity, but it's this podcast, American Scandal.
Oh,
If you haven't listened to this, I mean, fantastic. It's a great lesson on history, but it revolves around American Scandal, and you'll see the kind of the logo for the podcast is this guy looking at it's like a front page newspaper. And if we behave as if everything we do is going to end up on the front page of the newspaper, we want we want to um, we want to conduct ourselves that it won't end up on American Scandal, but it'll be celebrated and rejoiced. And again, when we can lead with integrity, ourselves, the organizations that we represent, eventually they will end up on the front page of the newspaper. And the question is, what do we want that headline to be? Is this an
mm,
American Scandal, or is it a celebration of a mission achieved by our nonprofit organization or by our leadership? And that's the goal here. There's a recommended resource, and I love this book. John Maxwell, he's one of my favorite leadership gurus. He wrote the book, There's No Such Thing as Business Ethics. I actually brought this up at an unconventional business network meeting I was at earlier. Was that this week or last week? It may have been last week, but we were talking about business ethics, and John Maxwell says there's no such thing as business ethics. And that kind of brings up, it's an interesting topic. And there, if you look closely, the subtitle, there's only one rule for making decisions. What John Maxwell is making a case for in this book is there's no such thing as business ethics. There are only ethics. It's not business morals and personal morals. It's just morals. It's doing the right thing, regardless of whether it's in business or in our personal lives. And so he's saying ethics are ethics. It doesn't matter what the descriptive word is before the word ethics, whether it's business or personal. And when he says there's only one rule for making decisions, the rule he is referring to is the golden rule, treating other people the way that we would want to be treated. And this is a wonderful book at how he can he does a beautiful job at tying in that golden rule into how we make decisions when it comes to our organizations. For those of you who are working in the corporate or business setting, and even our own personal lives, when we treat other people the way that we want to be treated, things tend to ethically work out pretty well. And I think that's not a recommended resource, but a great philosophy of ethics to take on. So I want to share that recommended resource with you. And let's look at an essential foundation. Again, we're talking about personal integrity here. So when it comes to just our personal integrity, I wish I didn't have to say this, but here's just a really good starting point for us to put into practice no matter where we're at. And the starting point is never lie. There's something about trying to be a little deceptive with our words, or not tell the truth, which is lying. And I think if humanity just put this into practice, what if it didn't lie? I think when it came to integrity, that would raise all of our integrity 1,000%.
wow.
When it came to American, the American Scandal podcast, I bet if people erase lies, they might not have any content for their podcast. I think that's a lot of times like the step one of a scandal is this little lie, little deception. I'm not going to tell the truth. Now, if never lie is our starting point, I think the topmost tier to strive for is to always tell the truth. And we can get into, does honesty need to be brutal? Does it we need to be brutally honest, or can we just be honest with some care and some love? Is there appropriate time to sugarcoat some truth? And I think there is, but definitely never lie. And at best, I mean, at least never lie. At best, always tell the truth. So that's speaking into our personal integrity. Okay, so that's
Aaron,
point one. Yes.
I think one of the things, I think this is one of those areas where culture gets in our way. And I'm interested in how often people will use this phrase. It's culturally acceptable. We'll say, so I'm not even going to lie. And I think, does that mean that you have been and now you're going to not lie? I mean, I'm just curious, but it becomes a part of the culture. And the other thing is, well, I'm going to be honest. And again, that begs the question in my mind, why are you going to start now? We've known each other for so long. Now you're going to be honest. But anyhow, I mean, those are some really casual ways that I think what you have on the screen, that we deviate from this essential foundation. And that is that it's based on truth and trust. And I think the more we can that our words can align with our intent, the more likely it is that our lives are going to align with our words.
Yeah. And the reason I start off with personal integrity, and I'm not here to, if you want to go to church, that was a couple days ago, right? You can go to church on Sunday and get a sermon, but integrity, it has to start with us. If we want institutional integrity, if we want organizational integrity, it's going to start with a person, and typically that person is going to be a leader. So we have to start with us. So I don't think anyone's going to be disagreeing here. By practice, we may disagree, but by philosophy or principle, no one will disagree and go, I disagree. So let's move on to number 2. And this I'm going to talk about this. If point 1 was personal integrity, everybody's watching. Point 2, this is more of a leadership integrity. And so here we're going into, can we build an organization? Can we structure a culture with integrity behind it? And so I'm going to take it to another level. Of course, we need personal integrity. It starts there, but then we also want to bring integrity to our leadership. And so this is where I want to talk about integrity, not only just doing the right thing when nobody's watching, but if we use the word integrity when we talk about a constructed object, let's say a bridge. If we'll say the bridge has integrity because we can drive on top of it. A bridge has a lot of integrity. If a huge semi with a heavy load can drive on top of it, that's a bridge that has integrity. Engineers use that term. You want to build a thing with good integrity. We want our organization to have good integrity, meaning it has strength to withstand the pressures that may come upon it. Our organizations are made up of people. I want to speak specifically to staff and volunteer. And when I teach this in a leadership context, most of the time I'm talking with volunteers, but I want to speak to how we lead staff as well, because they kind of go hand in hand. But when we are leading people, we want to make sure that our organization has integrity. So think of it this way. One of the first things I encourage my leaders to do as they start leading volunteers is I tell them to give permission for volunteers not to show up. And usually they think this is counterintuitive. This is the exact opposite. I need to recruit volunteers so they do show up. What do you mean give them permission to not show up? And here's what I mean. In the volunteer world, especially in the nonprofit space, when someone decides to volunteer, they're doing something they don't have to do. Okay, so that's kind of the definition of volunteer. Like, they're not getting paid. There's no obligation. And there's usually some passion point. There's some reason why they're volunteering. They've been touched by the mission. They're moved by the mission. They're a product of the mission. Maybe a family member has gone through the mission and been influenced. And so there's this heart connection. And volunteers, this is oddly enough, volunteers sometimes put a higher pressure on themselves to show up for volunteering than what staff will put on themselves to show up for their paycheck, right? And sometimes you have to drag the staff in, and the volunteers, it's like they keep showing up. But do both staff and volunteer, do they have permission to not show up? So what if the volunteer is, let's start with kind of an over-exaggerated example. What if they're sick? I've had volunteers show up and they're physically ill. They're sick, and I have to send them back home. That's kind of hard to do, right? As a leader who relies on volunteers, like, no, you need to go home. But what if we take it not just into physical health, but what about relational health, right? We should have relationships with our volunteers and our staff. If a volunteer shows up to help someone else's life get better, but their marriage is on the rocks right now and they need to spend some time with their spouse, am I secure enough as a leader to tell the volunteer, hey, maybe the best thing for you and for the organization is to go spend some time with your spouse? Maybe the relationship with the volunteers' children, man, we just had a rough day. I feel like my kids hate me right now. I left the house, things were really tense. Can we send them back home and say, hey, why don't you go take your son out to get some ice cream? Why don't you go take your daughter on a daddy daughter date and spend some time and mend that relationship? And that's not just the best thing for the volunteer, it's also the best thing for the organization, because volunteers can only give,
Mm.
they can only pour out from what they have in their cup. And if their cup is empty, right? If there's relational damage, relational tension in their lives, and their cup is already empty, they need to get that thing filled up before they have anything to pour back out into the guests that we serve in our organization. And maybe they can fake it till they make it for a day or for a week or for a month, but eventually they're going, that'll lead to burnout. And we got to make sure that we are, whether it's staff or volunteers, the people that we lead, we got to make sure that they're being filled up emotionally, physically, spiritually. I mean, fill in the blank. We got to make sure that they're at a healthy place so they have something to offer those whom we serve. And so when I'm talking about staff and volunteer care having leadership integrity that bleeds through to our organization, our organization's at a place where people are healthy to serve at, to work at, to be involved. And some of the some of the best decisions I've made when I've led volunteers is encourage them not to show up. Now, this was really easy in COVID, right? When there is a test you can take and there was a diagnosis and there was a social expectation, like if you have COVID, don't show up. But I think we need to apply that same standard to all these other areas in life. If the best thing that our volunteer can do is to go see their counselor or therapist, then that's the best thing that they can do. We don't want this obligation of volunteering to get in the way. Now, what is the fear? What is the fear? And I bet if we were to type this down, the pushback I always get is like, well, Aaron, if you do that, no one will show up, right? What if nobody shows up? What if everybody needs their cup filled and we still have the mission to do on the Wednesday night or the Friday morning, the weekend thing? We need people to show up. This is a cultural norm that we need to make, is show up when you're healthy. And if this is a cultural change that you need to implement in your organization, you may have a couple light attended days, the first couple times you implement this leadership practice of taking care of your volunteers, making sure that we have integrity. But once that becomes a normal part of your culture, people are going to show up, and they're actually going to be happy to show up, because you're not just giving them an opportunity to serve within the mission, but you're caring for them as a person. And that's what leadership is. And when you care for people as individuals, you treat people like treat people instead of treating people just like a volunteer, just a volunteer. When you minister to their heart, they're going to show up. And when they do show up, they're going to have a full cup, and they're going to have so much ready to pour out that it's just going to help drive the mission forward all the better. So,
So Aaron, I got a question
uh-huh.
for you. With 2 decades of experience and leading by offering, inviting people to not show up, how many times have you had everybody stay home?
Never.
Right. So
Never.
it's a legitimate fear, but there's a degree of irrationality, which is what our fears
Yes.
are, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the point you have both from concept and from experience is it's a natural fear, but it's not going to happen.
Right. And in fact, I've had a couple times where, on a certain night, a few of my volunteers gave me a heads up, hey, I can't make it. I can't make it. So this come up, like I need to spend some time with the spouse. The kids got to play. I have to be at it. Happened to be on this night, and I thought, oh man, it's a little more absences than I'm comfortable with, and so I sent a personal text to everyone else on the team and said, "Hey, I'm going to be a little short tonight. I haven't heard from you. Can you please show up?" That actually, I'm this one particular night I'm thinking of. I thought it was going to be one of my lowest attended nights for on a volunteer level. It actually ended up being the highest because
Oh,
everyone
wow.
else showed up because
Nice.
I was a little worried. Oh, some people aren't
Yeah.
going to show up. And here's the other thing: when you care about people and you don't guilt them, but you actually encourage them
Yeah.
to take care of themselves first before they show up to volunteer, they're more open to communicate with you, so you're not surprised with a bunch
Mm.
of absences
Okay.
when people are showing up. And then, man, everyone else showed up because they're like, "Well, we don't want to leave Aaron hanging, by himself." And it was like, "Oh, I didn't realize I had this many volunteers." They all showed up
Yeah.
because I made the personal ask
Yeah.
because I was getting communicated to. Some weren't going to show up.
Yeah. That's
Uh,
powerful.
this is the classic word picture that illustrates this point. We've all been on the flight. We know the spiel. In the unlikely event of a loss of pressure in the cabin, oxygen masks are going to fall down. And they tell you how to pull the straps to put on your mouth. And they say that phrase, put yours on first before you help the person next to you, especially if you're next to the elderly or children, put your oxygen mask on first. And so I'd flown pretty much my whole life. But when I had kids, I realized the flight attendants come by and reiterate the point to you as a parent when you have a child next to you. And they say this because there's that parental instinct of like, no, save my baby, take me instead. Like I'll sacrifice myself. The reason they have to tell the parents this is because mom and dad, if you don't put your mask on first, you're going to pass out. And then no one's going to be there to help your child, help your little baby. But if you put your oxygen mask on first, even if your child passes out, they'll come back if once you put their oxygen mask on after yours is on. And it's a very selfish thing to try to help someone else get their mask on when you don't have your own on. It's selfish to do that because the likelihood of fatality is now the number two instead of the number zero. And a lot of times we think we're being selfless when we're pouring out of an empty cup, which is like, yeah, it's kind of a selfish thing to do because we're gonna if everyone does that, the plane's going to end up with zero people with oxygen. We want everyone to have oxygen. So as leaders, we have our oxygen mask, pumping in our own personal integrity. At that point, we can encourage our volunteers to get their masks on, help them. And then as we lead leaders, it just keeps on passing it on. But that's a word picture that we've all got. So, think through, practically, with staff, are you encouraging them to use their paid time off, their sick leave, their vacation time? Obviously, it's their decision to make. I know there's HR mandates that you can't force people to take time off, but encourage, let that be a part of your culture. Use your vacation time. Go recharge those batteries. I mean, most of us are solar powered. In the winter, go someplace warm. Get that sun. In the summer, take off, do a family vacation. Are we using all of
Mm.
our opportunities? If you have the flexibility within your company, and this will vary from organization to organization, but is there flex if someone needs to show up late to work or needs to leave early? Can that be comped somewhere else, somehow else? Are we encouraging mental health with our volunteers? Do we have the relationship with them? And do we even know how healthy they are? Do we know what family life is like? Are we shaming them when they don't show up, or are we encouraging it? Do we have communication lines open so we can find out when people can't show up, when they need to stay home? And again, do we guilt trip them, or do we encourage that and applaud that? So those are some ways that we can implement these ideas in our leadership with our staff and volunteers. Here's kind of the third leg of integrity that I want to talk about today, decision factors. So if we talked about personal integrity, we talked about leadership integrity. This is more of organizational integrity, but do we have integrity when we are making decisions? And kind of stealing from the first definition that Mr. Brick threw out for us, integrity is doing the right thing even when nobody's watching. We need to do that for our personal lives, but are we doing that on an organizational level also? Now, sometimes the boardroom needs to be shut so we can have candid conversation. But at the end of the day, can we go public with every decision that we make? And if we can't, then maybe there's a lack of some sort of integrity. If we can't, we need to be asking why not. Again, this is not talking about confidentiality or anything like that, but we want our decisions to be so solid that we can print them on the front page of the newspaper and be proud of it, instead of American Scandal printing it on the front page of the newspaper, putting it on the podcast and being ashamed of it. And I don't think he's the first guy to say this, but he's the first guy I heard it from. Rob Wagner said, "You make your decisions, then your decisions make you." And this is true not only on a personal level, but on an organizational level. And if we decide to start cutting corners or just kind of blurring the line in between what we think is ethically okay and ethically not okay, business ethics, is it legal? I don't think is it legal is the proper standard to have. I think we go back to John Maxwell's idea of there's only one rule for making decisions, and that's the golden rule. Are we treating other people the way that we would want to be treated? That's the standard that we want to have for our decisions. Now, when it comes to either an organization or a specific leader, I'm just curious, who embodies the characteristic of integrity? So let's put this in the chat box. This can be a personal relationship that you have. This can be a globally known figure. But when you think of a man or woman of integrity, who comes to mind? So let's just throw some of these out here. This is a time for some interaction. I'd love to hear from you. Who do you think of when you think of the word integrity? So we see, Kent said, my dad, Paul Mills, great man of integrity. I know him. He's a university president. Who else?
Brick said, Aaron Stroman.
Yeah, it's a little self-promoting. But thank you, Jeremy. Anyone else? When you think of a person of integrity, as you're thinking about this and writing it down, I think of Billy Graham. He was a Christian evangelist. One of the reasons, especially towards later in his life, he would get booked to speak at places or pray in the White House, is because he's one of these Christian leaders that, he's a pastor, which regardless of your faith, he never got caught up in a scandal. He lived a life of integrity, and that adds up over the years. So, Lori Jonas. Rachel said, Lori Jonas, my friend and co-founder. Wonderful woman of integrity. Kelly talked about her board president. Man, when your board president has integrity, that makes life really easy. It makes the board meetings. I say the word easy. It may make some difficulties, but at the end of the day, you rather have to deal with the matters of wrestling with the issues versus wrestling with matters of integrity. Daryl Harvey, Randy, I'd love to hear more about Daryl Harvey from Work Matters. And Greg Prim, yeah, he's a law enforcement officer, man of integrity. And so we can think of examples of integrity. Man, when we're talking about integrity, and earlier we talked about the fear. Okay, when we want to have integrity with our organizations, and we give staff and volunteers permission to not show up so they can be healthy, and the fear is, well, what if no one shows up? sometimes there's this fear if we've made a decision in our past that has compromised our own integrity. In fact, why don't we all write down the most embarrassing way that we've compromised our integrity in the chat box? Just put out, I'm kidding, don't put out there. That was a joke, right? Because we don't like to do that. It's like, no, I'm not going to tell you how I've compromised my integrity. But we all have. We all have. The fear is if someone found out my life is over, my career is over, if I don't have a career, then I don't have a job, and I'm going to be living out on the streets, and my family, my kids are going to be in cardboard. Our mind goes to this really dark place. But if you've never listened to this TED talk by Jocko or read his book Extreme Ownership, I put it up here as a TED talk because it's an easy 15-minute listen. But the first chapter, he talks about this, but he was in a situation where like the worst scenario in war happened. It was friend on friend fire. So the people, his troops were in battle and they were shooting against friendly troops. And that's a big deal. Like that's the number one no in the military world is like, you don't shoot at your own people and you don't injure your own people. You don't kill your own people. But this happened. And was it his direct fault? No, but he took complete ownership of it. And so when the higher ups in command came and held him accountable, whose fault was this? He looked at them and said, it's my fault. And when he owned that, he didn't get fired. He didn't get discharged. People around him said, no, it was my fault. It was my fault. It was my fault. And the higher ups looked and said, man, you own this. They actually respected him for that. And he, now he's talking about it because it was, there was a mistake made, but he didn't try to hide it. He owned it. And I think that's where the scandals end up happening is when we all make mistakes. Every organization makes a mistake. When we try to hide it, that's really where the integrity gets broken, right? The integrity might get compromised in the bad decision or a failure at some point in the operation. When we can own it and publicize it ourselves, people tend to admire the honesty. When we try to hide it, man, it's like there's no mercy or forgiveness when you try to hide it and cover it up. And again, recommend a resource, either the book or the podcast or there's a podcast too, but the TED Talk on YouTube. Look those up. Jocko, Extreme Ownership. And it's such a beautiful picture of being able to own the mistake, own the compromise, and not try to cover it up. But when we own it, that's just the way humanity works. There tends to be a much greater margin for grace when we own it versus trying to cover it up. And again, I think that piece of integrity is something that our world needs today. I'm trying to think of, I thought of an example when, when I had to own something. Oh yeah. When I was working at a nonprofit, I was making a purchase and I had a organization credit card and I didn't have my tax deduction sheet. I forget what it's called right now. Tax exempt card on me. And I made a purchase and it was a hassle and I ended up paying tax and I knew it wasn't the right thing, but it was under $200, it wasn't a lot of money. And I was working it out of my department's budget. So it's like, whatever, I'll pay for it. Well, the finance office found it, and they called me in, Aaron, you made just purchase. Why'd you pay tax? So I didn't have my card on me. I didn't think it was a big deal. And, it's kind of embarrassing. It's like, oh man, I didn't do what I knew was right out of convenience. And have you ever had to go back and get tax taken off of a prior purchase? It's a nightmare. I mean, it took me like 90 minutes once I got to the place for them to do this thing. And it just goes, it was just a good reminder, like, just do it right the first time. You know, it may be a little bit inconvenient, even if you don't think it's a big deal, but sometimes those little lapses on our integrity at the beginning grow into bigger things. And it's like, oh, okay, I just need to do it right the first time. What's the furthest distance in between 2 points? A shortcut. It's like, don't take any shortcuts, just do it right. And I mean, it taught me the lesson. Like, I don't want to go through that experience again. I'll go back and print off another tax exempt sheet and go through the process. You know, it's just miserable, but
Never
uh,
again.
never again. Okay. So Aaron's talked a lot. Let's open up just for some question and response. And maybe this is even comment and response, because I don't want to slander anyone, but if you're in a particular situation where you might need some advice on, or if you have a good example of, hey, here's a moment where integrity just shone bright, and I only have more respect for the person because of their integrity, feel free to share that. If you want to drop that in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself, ask a question, or share a story, we do have some time. We've got about 9 minutes or so, but any questions or comments or stories?
Yeah. So, Aaron, while people are thinking about this, I've had the privilege of working with countless organizations over the years, and the biggest obstacle that I find, and of course, most of my work is in the area of fundraising. Biggest obstacle is when we have a credibility deficit or reputation disorder, right? And so, almost every problem, apart from that, can be solved with money. But there's no amount of money you can get to buy back the reputation, whether it's an individual or an organization. And so, again, at the organizational level, and I love the example that you shared. What was the financial consequence of the mistake that you made? It was not huge, but extrapolated over a year, it would amount to a huge thing. Easiest thing in the world is to correct something that's been done wrong, and what impact did that make on you? Like you said, you're never going to do it again. So, and again, I love the point that you made of what's hidden will eventually become known, and the cost of the unknown becoming known is so much more than the cost of either avoidance or correction in the first place. So, thanks for making those points.
Yeah. Well, and the board has a certain type of responsibility, fiduciary responsibility,
Yeah.
and some of the most valuable dialogue and debate the board can have is on some things that seem seemingly small. Like, I mean, this didn't even make it to the boardroom, but paying $15 in tax on a $150 purchase. But whenever the conversation becomes, okay, what are we going to do about this situation? How are we going to handle this? Do we need to hide it and cover it up, or deal with it out in the open? Always default to deal with it out in the open. And you may be irritated in the moment, like, this is going to take more time and more energy than it deserves. Mm-hmm. But that ounce of prevention, an ounce of integrity prevention is worth way more than a pound of cure.
Yeah. And Jeremy shared a proud dad moment in the chat box. He said, Jay, his son, hit the neighbor's car with a basketball. He went up and told the person what happened. The next day, they both went over to the house, talked to him. They were happy that he came and told them. Super proud father. Way to go, Jeremy. Kudos to you and to your son. Yeah. So anybody else have a thought, a comment, or question you want to chime in with? And while people are thinking about that, Aaron, I think we got some things coming up. You want to just kind of unpack some things while people are gathering their comments or questions together?
Yeah. There's some quote on integrity. Integrity is something money can't buy. It's priceless. You can't pay money for it, but once it's gone. So we have an Asking Academy Classic coming up July 25th and 26th. That's when it summits. We also have one in October 24th and 25th. So the Asking Academy Classic is for teams to master the art of conversational fundraising, specifically honing in on major and mega gifts. So if you're a part of a nonprofit and need to up your fundraising game, you want to check out the Asking Academy Classic. We also have a virtual condensed version called the Asking Academy Express. And this one's coming up June 27th and 28th. This is more geared for individuals. If you have a team, you want to come to the classic, but if you just want to get some personal work on your fundraising expertise, feel free to register, contact us for the Asking Academy Express. All info on that is at askingacademy.com as well. So if you want to go to askingacademy.com, you'll get a lot more info and detail on what that event looks like. We just had one of those last week and it was fantastic. It's a lot of fun.
That was huge. Yeah.
We also have another webinar coming up. What is that? Tuesday, June 13th. And we're having a guest, Courtney Thomas. She's a CEO here in the Kansas City area, but we're going to have the topic of CEO insights, taking your leadership to the next level. So make sure to plug in for the next 47-minute webinar. You'll get some info and communication from us on that. Kent, I think this next one's yours.
Yeah. So in just a minute, we're going to ask everybody if you'll take just a minute to share a top takeaway, something from today that you can use. But in the meantime, another thing coming up, June 16th. So just a month from today, the regional conference, AFP Dallas-Fort Worth puts on this, it's a one-day conference. And Aaron's been invited to speak on a topic. Actually, his new book, which just came out, was that last month or earlier this month? Anyhow, volunteer leadership training for nonprofits. And you'll have an opportunity to hear Aaron really unpack some deep leadership lessons and the value and impact of training. If you are in the Dallas-Fort Worth area or know somebody who is, or if you want a great getaway for a day, add this to your schedule. I'm looking forward to being in the room that day as well.
And in the chat box, what is your top takeaway from the webinar today? Whether it's an idea, just an affirmation of a current practice you've already implemented. Maybe it's a reminder of hey, I need to circle back with this one thing and make sure I lead with integrity. But feel free to drop in the chat box where your top takeaway is. Being truthful always. Leading with integrity means taking care of your staff and volunteers.
Good one, Jerry. Thank you.
And we have a guy on the call who could lead the whole webinar on that. You know, Jeremy Brick has a bunch of employees under his leadership, and he leads with an extremely personal touch. Leading with integrity is leading by example. Yeah, integrity is one of those. You can't delegate. You can't delegate integrity.
Yeah, another thing, just a quick application. We talk about people give to people they know, like, and trust. And the people that we know and like and trust are those people that are trustworthy, and they're trustworthy because their life demonstrates integrity. So yeah, it shows up intangibly or in personal relationships, but more visibly as it relates to fundraising for our organizations.
Absolute.
Oh, wow. A couple of really great ones here. What was it? Rachel had a person had to come back and step back due to personal matters because of my response and support. They'll eventually come back. You can count on that for sure. Mm-hmm. And Randy Sharp, preparing to take leadership of 2 volunteer teams who don't know him yet. got a lot to learn about leading well, communicating expectations as they get to know you. Yeah, and it's amazing how quickly people pick up on our personal values, whether we voice them or not. Yeah, definitely leading with integrity. Got 1 or 2 minutes or more responses before we wrap up today.
Well, let's do a couple giveaways. Randy, why don't you your send me a direct message with your number or email, and I'd love to give you a copy of the volunteer leadership training for nonprofits. There's some ways some very practical practices I'd love to put in your hands on
Cool.
how you can develop some of those relationships. And then going to give away a free lunch to Jeremy Brick to Pepper Jacks. This is kind of a personal.
Ooh.
He's the first attendee to a 47-minute webinar from my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community. So he's the first one. So I'll give him a little. I'll buy his lunch since he's in the area. And thanks for joining. No matter where you are, no matter where you are. So with that, let's go to. What does this next slide say? Thank you. Thank you for logging on today and joining us for the 47-minute webinar. Man, we're wishing you every success with your volunteer leaders, success in your own endeavor to be a leader of integrity.